Hey guys, it's been a while. It's only been 9 months. Yeah, it's been 9 months since I made the last chapter of My Teacher Flunked the Planet. But don't worry, because I'm here, and that's all that matters. So, chapter 9 is called Button Pushers. I can't exactly say that I remember what happened in the last chapter, but you probably do. So, here we go. When the first flight was finally over, we were all exhausted, and not just because we had stayed up for most of the night. It was the things we had seen, the feelings they had created, that were the most tiring. Even now I don't remember how I got out of the saucer and into bed. But I must have, somehow, because the next thing I knew, the sun was shining in my face, and I realized that I had a pillow beneath my head. I wondered if Broxholm had carried me upstairs. I could remember my father doing that once, when I was very little. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the night before. My mind kept coming back to the 2 doctors in Ethiopia, and the man who had died trying to save the boy on the battlefield in Asia. No one was forcing those doctors to stay there. No one had forced that man to risk his life for the boy. Coville had said we were looking for hope. We had found a little even in the worst of places. Maybe things weren't hopeless after all. After a while, I noticed Big Julie's breathing. I glanced at the clock beside my bed. Almost noon. Fishing some clean clothes out of my backpack, I dressed and wandered downstairs. Susan, Coville, and Broxholm were in the kitchen already, eating breakfast. Since the aliens weren't wearing their masks, the scene looked like a cross between Leave It to Beaver and the Twilight Zone. "Have a Plusket," said Coville as I sat down. She handed me something round and purple. I stared at it. "You eat it," said Broxholm. I had already figured that out, but I was thinking of the people we had seen the night before. How could I eat after that? "Starving yourself won't help them," Broxholm said sharply, as if he had read my mind. "Eat." I hesitated a bit longer, then took a bite, promising myself I would find some way to help change what we had seen. The Plusket was thick, crusty, and delicious. Something inside it tasted like berries. I began to wonder if Coville had chosen to disguise herself as a home economics teacher for a reason. "So what do we do now?" I asked as Duncan wandered into the room and Coville handed him a Plusket. "Field work," replied Broxholm, tucking something brown and squirmy into his mouth. "Food first," rumbled Big Julie. "Field work later." Broxholm pulled on his nose. I stand corrected. First we feed Big Julie, then we start our field work. "Who gets to feed him?" asked Susan. "You do." Susan jumped a little. Okay, I guess I did too. "Don't worry," whispered Coville, waving her nose. "He's just teasing you. You can all do it together." "How do we feed him?" asked Duncan nervously. "That's his meal," said Broxholm, pointing to some buckets next to the sink. "He doesn't eat as much as you might expect." "Well, not now," said Coville, "but that's because he's fairly inactive at the moment." "Anyway, finish your own meal first," said Broxholm. Julie can't wait. Can wait. The floorboards rumbled with Big Julie's displeasure. I started to get to my feet, but Broxholm motioned for me to stay in my chair. "I said he can wait," he repeated softly. "Traitor!" "Not so," replied Broxholm, raising his voice only a little. "You know the codes as well as I do." Big Julie's name. Coville's wormy lavender hair writhed in dismay. "Broxholm, there is no need to irritate him. And there is no need for him to be discourteous to our friends," replied Broxholm, giving me a wink. According to my translator, the wink meant nothing on Broxholm's native world. He was using it the same way we do, which was a little like speaking a foreign language with his body instead of his mouth. My mind grabbed at the gesture. A wink. There was something about a wink that I ought to remember, or figure out. What was it? Puzzled, I smiled at Broxholm and returned my attention to my meal. I finished quickly, and as soon as Duncan and Susan were ready, we crossed to the buckets, which we filled with a murky-looking concoction. "What is this stuff?" I asked, turning my head to avoid the smell. "Swamp water," Coville replied. "Local or imported?" asked Duncan. Broxholm smiled. Local. Big Julie likes to sample native cuisines. I picked up a pair of buckets and headed down the hall. I wonder what we're supposed to do next, said Susan, who was walking behind me. I mean, you can't feed an eyeball, right? She shouldn't have worried. Big Julie had shifted position. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face, so to speak, with the biggest mouth I had seen since Hulan took me for a ride in the Roomba. If we hadn't been there to feed Big Julie, I might not have known it was a mouth. I didn't see any teeth. He didn't even have one of those gonger things hanging at the back of his throat. All I could see was a big black hole. The only real mouth clue was the foot-high ridge of brown and green flesh at the bottom of the door, which I think was his lower lip. Just toss the stuff in, called Broxholm from the kitchen. Peter, look out, cried Duncan as I lifted my bucket. I jumped back barely in time to avoid a thick strip of moist brown and green flesh that rolled through the door and slapped into the opposite wall. It was textured like a sponge and covered with fist-sized knobs. What is that? Asked Susan. His tongue, said Duncan with a shudder. Ah! I started to say, let's do this and get it over with, but held in the words for fear of insulting Big Julie. Not speaking, being careful to avoid stepping on the tongue, I got as close to the door as I could, then tossed in my buckets of swamp water. Susan did the same, and then Duncan. After a few seconds, the great green and brown tongue slid back through the door. A wall of flesh descended over the black hole, and a sigh of contentment rumbled through the floorboards. We closed the door and headed for the kitchen. As I was sitting down, the cups on the table began to rattle, like you'd see in a film about an earthquake. Good, said Cleveland. He liked the meal. The rumbling was Big Julie's belch of appreciation. With Big Julie fed, we started to discuss our field work again. To my surprise, the first thing the aliens wanted us to do was get disguises. That turned out to be more fun than I expected, partly because when it was time to make them, Cleveland said, "Well, how would you like to look?" I didn't know how to respond at first. I had always wanted to look like the heroes on the covers of the science fiction books I read. But you couldn't put a face like that on a kid's body. As it turned out, what I could do was use my U-Rat to design my mask. I sat and played with different features until I had a face I liked. Then I sent the design of my U-Rat to the mask machine. A few minutes later, it delivered my new face. Broxholm showed me how to put it on, then gave me a mirror. I stared at myself in astonishment. I had dark hair and eyes, a perfectly formed nose, and a mouth that somehow looked a lot more heroic than mine. I'm not sure exactly what makes a mouth look heroic, but believe me, mine did. I know you should judge people on the basis of what's inside, not how they look. Now I found I was judging myself by looks. With a different face, I felt different. I wasn't entirely happy to discover this about myself. Maybe we should choose new names to go with our new faces, said Duncan once we were all wearing our masks. I want to be Albert. Though he didn't say it, I was pretty sure he was naming himself after Albert Einstein. I didn't laugh, so it annoyed me when I said, "Okay, I'm going to be Stony." And Duncan said, "Where did you get that name?" I didn't want to say that Stony was the name of my favorite science fiction hero. It took me a while to realize how funny it was that Duncan was naming himself after a great brain, while I was naming myself for an action hero. "How about you, Susan?" asked Cleveland. "I'll just be Susan, thanks," she said with a smile. "I like my name just fine." We spent the next 2 weeks traveling all over the world, looking at the best and the worst of what we humans do. We roamed museums where I saw artwork so beautiful it made me weep, and streets so thick with starving people that I woke up in the night haunted by their hungry eyes. We began to refer to the bad sights as button pushers, things that might convince the aliens to use the red button. Things that gave us hope, like the night we saw by a fire in Africa and listened to an old man tell a story of how the world began, were called button busters. I was truly happy to have my universal translator that night. The storyteller's words pulled me into the spell, and I felt joined with all the other listeners, almost as if we were one being. It was one of the best nights of my life. The next day, we saw the worst button pusher of all. That was the day we crept invisible into a prison where men and women were being tortured for disagreeing with their government. What had already been done to those people was so ugly I cannot bring myself to describe it, even though the memory of it remains like a scar burned into my brain with a hot iron. Even worse was the memory when it was about to start again. When I saw the uniformed man was going... Even worse was the moment when it was about to start again. When I saw what the uniformed man was going to do to the woman strapped to the table, I pressed myself against the wall and closed my eyes. But even when my hands clamped over my ears, I couldn't shut out her scream. The scream lasted less than half a second. For the first and only time during the entire mission, Broxholm broke the non-involvement rule. When I opened my eyes, I saw that he had knocked the torturer unconscious. I could spend pages telling you how we snuck the prisoners to freedom. It was quite an adventure. And Susan did an amazing thing, but it's not really part of this story. I'll tell you only that I still have nightmares about the room, and that Broxholm trembled with fury for an entire day afterward. I think he was beginning to believe that maybe the red button was the only solution after all. To ignore the starving is one thing, he told me, but to actively... He broke off in a shudder. There is a great mystery here, said Coville. The best of what your people create shows a deep longing to join together. Yet the worst of what you do seems to come from some great separation, as if you don't even recognize yourselves as members of the same species. They're hopeless, said Big Julie. They're hopeless. I wondered if that would be his message to the Interplanetary Council. I could hardly stand to bring him his swamp water that evening. It felt traitorous to be feeding a creature who believed we should be destroyed. About 10 minutes after Big Julie's wall-rattling burp of appreciation, someone began knocking at the door. Coville was instantly alert, like a wild animal when it hears an unexpected sound. "Who could that be?" she whispered. Indeed, no one should have been knocking at her door, since Miss Carpew was supposed to be out of town with Susan. "Probably just some salesman," I whispered back. The knocking sounded again, louder than before. "This is the police," yelled a deep male voice. "Open up in there." "Plevitt," said Coville. This was a word from her own language, and it's so bad I have no translation for it. More banging. We had taken off our masks to relax, so neither Broxholm nor Coville had on a human face. Susan was supposed to be away on her scholarship trip, and I was presumed to have been kidnapped by aliens. Either of us answering the door would raise dangerous questions. That left Duncan, though if he were to go to the door, the police would almost certainly insist on returning him to his home. "Maybe we should just hide," said Susan. Bang, bang, bang. "No good," replied Broxholm. "It sounds like they're getting ready to break the door down. If they do that, they'll almost certainly find Big Julie." He didn't have to explain what a disaster that would be. "I'd better get it," said Duncan. "Wait," said Susan as he started for the door. "No," said Broxholm. "He's the only one who can do it. Come on, the rest of us have to get out of sight." Glancing over my shoulder, as we headed for the stairs, I wondered if Duncan would ever stop surprising me. And that's the end of chapter 9. It was kind of a long one. Next is chapter 10, called Evacuate. See ya!